So when Scott invited me to speak tonight, I was like, yeah, I'm honored and humbled to do it, but I really don't want to preach because it feels weird for me just to come in and, like, hey, I've read this text and these are the things I'm going to say to you about God, where I feel like there's so much life and truth in God in each of you. And I'd really like to share in that, but I'm happy also to share my story or a bit of my story. And like Scott said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you feel you want to ask. But I can start off by saying that I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, where Jessica is from, and I grew up in a small town just north of there, Yulee, Florida, which is right on the border of Florida and Georgia. I'm 50 now. I'll be 51 this year. I worked at a couple of churches, actually 3 churches while I lived in Seattle, about 19 years. But getting back to Florida, grew up in a pretty small town. And if you know anything about the South, or just life in the U.S. for folks who don't live in the U.S., which is amazing that there are folks who are across the globe who are present on the call tonight. I mean, the U.S., but Florida in particular, has its own racist, not just history, but racist practices. And so the experience of Christianity that I grew up in, really an intersection of religious conservatism, homophobia, and racism all wound together. And so it was a really difficult place to grow up as someone who was coming to know himself as a queer person. I grew up in a pretty conservative Baptist family and attended the Baptist church for most of my growing up years. And there, I know, is it Hanea did a interview on me, and I've not seen the interview yet, and they're not here tonight, and so I don't know how much people have seen of my story. I mean, I actually have a pretty joyful childhood overall, but there are some really difficult and challenging parts to it. I was a survivor of sexual abuse from early on, and that experience of being violated by someone who was also a faith leader in my community and who was a respected friend of my family really reshaped and damaged my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be in relationship to God, and how I saw myself. Because of that experience, I viewed myself as sinful and shameful and someone who wasn't deserving of God's love. And so that was foundational to my experience when that started, before I'd say probably around the age of 4. But I grew up in the church and I always had a sense of God's presence and God's love, or I was taught about God's love, but I also never felt deserving of it. And then I think in my teenage years, as I grew in my understanding of my own sexual desires and feelings, it was hard to separate my true identity as a queer man from the abuse experience that I'd grown up with. And so, I mean, it took years, I'd say, for me to figure out how to integrate those two things and to feel more whole. I also grew up in conservative religious experiences. I went to youth groups similar to you all, but definitely not on Zoom at that point. And there was, again, this notion of what it meant to be a Christian. Everything was very much in a box that, Christians do this and people who are not Christians do this. Queer people aren't really even talked about or accepted. Black people are in this box and white people are in this box. Men are in this box, women are in this box. There was no conversation for trans identity or any other way of being. But I'm grateful that even the foundation of religion that I had gave me a sense of God's love being bigger than the experiences that I knew growing up. And I think I always hoped and believed that God was bigger than what I knew. In college, I felt a sense of call to ministry. And I tried to shake it off for a while because, again, I had these experiences in my life and culture, which told me I was not deserving of the call to be a pastor. In my Baptist experience, a pastor was someone who was holy, who committed no sin, who was without spot or blemish. And I knew that, given my experience, what had happened to me, and as a kid, but also who I knew myself to be, that in my culture, there was no place for that. But somewhere in the midst of all that, I began to trust God. I ended up going to seminary with the hope that if this is the wrong thing, God's going to show me, and put me on a different path, and I will, do that instead of pursuing the notion of becoming a pastor. I went to seminary. I also have a master's in social work. At that point, and I joined the Presbyterian Church in college. People do a lot of experimentation in college. I became Presbyterian. I didn't really know many Presbyterians growing up and had never been to, well, I guess I'd been to a Presbyterian church for different events, but never worshiping there. But I found a place in the Presbyterian church in college. It gave me a place to answer or to ask questions, which I didn't really feel was a possibility for me growing up in the Baptist church. It gave me a place to challenge some of the theological truths that had been taught as a kid, to see a broader, more expansive sense of God than what I'd known growing up. But when I finished seminary, the Presbyterian Church, so this was in the mid to late 90s, 1996, I finished seminary, and I finished my MSW in 97. The Presbyterian Church was dealing with issues of sexuality in the US. Its rules around who could be ordained became more strict, and I was not out yet then. It wasn't safe to be at that point, even though I was 26 when I finished seminary, it wasn't a safe place to be out in the church. And so even though I worked in churches, I left the ordination process and just decided that it wasn't for me. And the phrase that I told myself, why should I want to be a part of a group that doesn't want me? That I felt like I spent so much of my life as a Black man in predominantly white cultures and situations seeking acceptance and validation, and now coming to know myself and love myself as a queer person, that if the church didn't want me, why should I jump through these hoops to try to find its approval? And I left my notion of what ordained ministry was for a while and did a variety of things. And I worked in theater, and I have a background in public health, and worked in HIV/AIDS care for years, which was a transformative and amazing ministry. And eventually, through a series of experiences, was drawn back into, I feel like I was tricked to getting ordained, and that's a whole nother story. But I felt God tricked me to saying yes, because I said yes in a personal prayer conversation with God, and then God worked out situations for me to end up being ordained. And I'm grateful for it because it's really transformed my life. One unique thing about me is that I'm the first out African American to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church in the US. And I know I'm not the first out, I'm not the first queer person to be ordained, queer Black person to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church, but I'm the first out African American to be ordained in the church. And it's a great honor, but I also recognize that there are siblings in Christ who've come before me who served the church for years, have had amazing careers and been amazingly dedicated to the church, but they weren't able to be their full selves. And so I'm honored to be in this position. And I know that I stand upon their shoulders and that they are here. I was praying about this earlier, that I was thinking of people that I know who have served in silence, but also people who are out. And I feel that their presence is here with me. And so it's an honor to be able to speak with you all tonight. And it's funny, Scott, that you say I'm the first person who said, use the term white privilege or white power, white privilege. And because I remember that training, but that was a long time ago. And I feel like our understanding of racial justice has expanded. Even though we've made great progress, there's still so much work to do. So thank you for reminding me of that. So that's just like a snippet of my life. Oh, I live in New York with my husband, Jason. We got married in 2019 in May. So we've been married for about a year and a half now. I've served 2 churches in New York and 1 church in Seattle since I got ordained. I now work at Union Theological Seminary as a chaplain, which basically means I provide spiritual support for folks in their seminary careers. I also work for the COVID Prevention Network on a faith initiative with 6 other consultants, helping raise awareness about COVID prevention among communities that are most impacted by that virus. So African Americans are Black folks, Latinx folks, and Native Americans in the US. And so currently we're in Barbados. We've been here since October 27th. And we plan on being here for a month, but the US hasn't given us reason to return yet. And so currently we're scheduled to be here until March 2nd. So that's broad strokes of my life. I think the thing that I'm most grateful for is the way that, even though I've had these really difficult experiences, traumatic experiences, the way that God's healing and presence has been with me, sort of drawing me back and creating a safe place for me. I would also encourage anyone who's interested, therapy is vital, and having supportive community where you can be your full self, your full, faithful, God-seeking, but also wounded and hurt self, because healing community will transform our lives. So, and I hope that the church can be a part of that for you. And I'm proud of each of you for knowing who you are at this age in your life, feeling bold enough that you can find community, because it's definitely brought great strength and hope to me, and that still sustains me today. So I think that's it for me, and then we can go to questions.